Hey guys, so we're back to our notes part two for week 29. So we were talking about regular parole, and now we're going to talk about intensive supervision parole. ISP parole has all of the same conditions as regular parole, except that there are weekly visits instead of monthly. So, for example, the parole officer will go to the parolee's house once a week, not once a month. He will visit the job once a week, not once a month, and then the parolee will need to go to the officer's office to make an office visit once a week, not once a month. And so it's intensive, as the name suggests. This type of supervision is for the more risky parolees. Like, we gave them parole, but we're not 100% comfortable that they're going to do everything they need to do. So we're going to keep them on a shorter leash, if you will. Um, so, sorry. Oh, let me move me. Yeah, okay. So a parolee can be violated, which means having his parole revoked for either violating any of his conditions, and those are called technical violations. You break curfew, you leave the county without permission, you quit your job. Those could be technical violations. Or you can get violated for any rearrest or committing a new crime. That's kind of automatic. So the parolee will return to prison if they get violated. They're sent back to prison where they will finish out their sentence. However much time they had left, that's how much time they can, go back to prison for. Otherwise, he will be on parole for the remainder of his sentence. And I want to pause here to say that the parole officer has a lot of discretion, not total discretion, but he can make some decisions. If a parolee has been perfect, let's say they got out, they were paroled, and they have 5 years of parole supervision. And for the first 3 years, they were absolutely perfect. They did not break a single rule. They did everything they were supposed to do. The parole officer has the discretion to cut them loose early, meaning you don't need to do another 2 years. You've done 3. You were perfect. Everything is good. I'm not saying that happens a lot, but it can happen for sure. But of course, if the parolee is, breaking rules here and there, that parole officer is not going to cut him loose early. So a parole officer is a peace officer. And that means that a peace officer, I think we talked about this a little bit before, a peace officer has the same arrest powers as a police officer. So a parole officer is a peace officer, and that means that they can make arrests, they carry a handgun and handcuffs. A PO usually wears plain clothes, and for the most part, they get to make their own hours. So this is one of the nice parts of the job. It's a serious job, and it can be very dangerous. These parolees know that if they get caught doing something they're not supposed to, that the parole officer has the power to send them back to prison. And parole officers get in fights, they get into foot chases, a lot of similar things like police officers. But they pretty much get to make their own hours, because remember, they're doing all these visits out and about in the community. They can't really do 40 hours a week in the office and then turn around and go back out at night to do house visits. And so the officer gets to, they still have to do full-time work, and they have to document what they're doing and where they're going. But they have a lot of flexibility. So that's nice. That's a nice part of the job. So, how do you become a parole officer? Well, you have to have a bachelor's degree. That's 4 years of college at minimum. Some of the majors that they prefer are criminal justice, social work, psychology, and human services. After you get your degree, you have to take and pass a civil service test. So this is New York State, New York and California are the only two that I know of that has civil service, which are state exams. And as you guys already know, it's the same thing for police officer. It's the same thing for corrections. It's the same thing for probation. The vast majority of our criminal justice field is going to require a civil service test. So you take and you pass the test, and your score puts you on a list. Highest score first, working their way down. You want to get as high up on that list as you can. And after that, you're going to have a background investigation. And we're going to talk more this week when we do a Zoom meeting about the background investigation and what all that entails and what they're looking for. And there was a background investigation document that I had shared with you. I want you to really take a good look at that. And then you do have to take a physical. So like I said, it is a physical job. It can be a physical job. Not quite as physical as a police officer. You're not regularly, potentially getting into fights and use of force and foot pursuits, but it could be. And so you need to have there's some minimum standards that you need to meet physically. But again, not as strict as a police officer. And then after that, you will go to a parole academy, and that's about 2 months. And they're teaching you everything you need to know about being a parole officer. And some of it's done at the academy, and then you'll get more training back at your office. You're probably going to be on probation as an employee for the first year. You're like a parole officer trainee. Until you're up and running and know exactly what you're doing. So parole officers are state employees. They get a New York State pension and benefits. They start at about $62,000 a year, and they can make up to $82,000. And that's just for parole officer 1, the entry level position. There's certainly lots of promotions. And you can just kind of like parole officer 2, parole officer 3, and then you could even become a supervisor. And of course, with every level that you go up, more money. So some parole officers work only with certain kinds of offenders. They specialize and get specific training for that type of offender. For example, sex offenders, pedophiles, domestic violence, drug addicts, drug dealers. Those are all niches or specialty areas. And we talked about this with probation officers. The two jobs are very, very similar. One is dealing with parolees. The other one is dealing with probationers. You can make the assumption that probationers are a little less dangerous, a little less tricky than a parolee is. I'm not saying that's true across the board. And remember, probation, you're a county employee. We're going to get into probation later. So parole officers are kind of like half police officer and half social worker. They are there to assist the parolee in any way that they can and help them work through problems. But they also have to be ready, willing, and able to arrest them and send them back to prison if need be. Parole officers work very closely with local law enforcement, and I mentioned that in last week's notes and lecture. So there is, I shared with you a parole officer exam announcement. It's a separate doc in your folder. I want you to take a look at it. Look at the minimum requirements to take the test. Look at the subjects on the examination. Go through that. Okay, so now we're going to switch and talk about halfway houses. So this whole week is community-based corrections. So we talked about parole, and now we're going to talk about halfway houses. Halfway houses are often mandated as a condition of parole. Parolees go to a halfway house for 6 months to a year, And the intent is to help them transition back into society. So you got to think, somebody who's been to prison for only a couple years, the transition back into society isn't really that big of a deal. But imagine somebody who's been locked up for 20 years. That transition is going to be pretty tricky. You're going from zero freedom to 100% freedom, with the exception of the rules of parole, but still, they're just out there. So halfway houses help transition them. Many inmates who have been in prison for many years become institutionalized. And that's a word you need to know. What does that mean? Institutionalized. It means that they gradually become less able to think and act independently because of having lived for a long time under the rules of an institution. I mean, remember, in prison, they're telling you when to get up, when to eat, when to go to the bathroom, when to go to work, when to go back to your cell. Every single thing, part of your life every single day is dictated by somebody else, a corrections officer. So there are rules in the halfway house, and some typical ones are, you have to obey curfew. So just like you're probably going to have a curfew on regular, when you're on you're on parole now in the halfway house, but obviously in the halfway house there's staff and there's rules and there's more structure than when you just go to your own apartment, right? When you're in your own apartment, you're still on parole and you still got to have a curfew. But when you're in the halfway house, you have to follow that curfew as well. And so I'm going to ask you guys some questions, and I want you to, write these answers down in our document together. We can discuss them in our Zoom meeting. Why? Why do you think having a curfew as an adult person is important when you're on parole? The parolee must go to work. Got to have a job. Remember, that was a condition of even being let out of prison. You had to have a job lined up before they released you on parole. So you have to go to work every day. When you're in the halfway house, you don't get to say, oh, I don't want to go to work. I don't feel like it. No, you got to go. The parolee must do chores in the house. Whoop, whoop. So like I said, there are staff there who are keeping notes, making reports, reporting to the parole officer about how the parolees are doing in the house. And another rule is chores in the house. Staff is not there to cook and clean for you. The whole point is to get you reacquainted with daily living skills. Daily living skills. You need to clean, you need to cook, you need to shop, you need to do your laundry, you need to go to work every day. And these chores are divided up among the house mates. And I think it's like on a weekly basis. So for this week, you're doing all the cooking. And next week, you do all the cleaning or vacuuming or what have you. So they divide it up. There's, I'm sure it's different house to house, but I'm going to say there's anywhere from 5 to maybe 10 parolees in a house. There really isn't going to be more than that. It's not some big, huge institution. It's a house. So 5 to 10 parolees. And everybody has their own chores that they have to do. So the parolee may not have any visitors or dates. Can't go on dates. So I'm not going to give you the answer right now. I want you guys to think about it. Why could a parolee, and when I say visitor, that means family, that means their kids, they may not come to the house to visit, the halfway house, to visit the parolee. Why do you think that rule is there? And what about dating? I mean, so what? If they go out on a date, why is that a big deal? It is a big deal. And I want to see what you guys come up with on your own. So the parolee, of course, cannot have any drugs or alcohol. So here's another question for you. Not every crime, not every parolee has a problem with alcohol, or alcohol was not necessarily involved in the crime. So why would there be a rule, if they're 21 and older and they want to have a beer at the end of the day, why can they not have that in the halfway house? You guys tell me what you think. And of course, the parolee must follow all other rules. So none of the rules are optional. If the parolee gets kicked out of the house, their parole will be violated and they will go back to prison. So again, staff that work in the halfway house, if there's problems, they're going to report directly to that parole officer. And if it gets to the point where the house is like, what, they're not doing it, they're not cutting it, it's problem after problem with them, that parole officer is going to violate them and send them right back to prison. Because if you think about it, if you can't, you've gone from complete control and structure in the prison to halfway being free, and you can't function in that. How are you going to function when you're completely free with no real restrictions? So oh, I already said that. And that's it. That's it for week 29 notes. I hope this was helpful. Let me know what you think, and I can't wait to talk to you guys Wednesday and Friday. Bye.